Thank you. This presentation is really investigating representations of artistic practice in Iniva's archive. So for the last couple of years, I've been working on Iniva's artist files archive. So I'm really going to just take you through understanding the context of the artist file collection, bias in our archival practice, especially relating to that case study, some of the things that we've been thinking about to try and combat that, and next steps and reflections. And kind of like Paul, I am going to be asking you questions back, because really I want this to be a reflective session, thinking about artistic practice in general, which I know you all are, because this is an ongoing project. It is still actively being catalogued, and yeah, really excited to get different perspectives and maybe, do some learning as well while I'm also presenting to you. So just to give context, what is Iniva? So Iniva is an evolving visual arts organization dedicated to nurturing and disseminating radical and emergent contemporary artistic practice, centering global majority African, Asian, Caribbean diaspora perspectives. It's also home to Iniva's archive and the Stuart Hall Library. The archive centers art education, exhibition making, publications, and proof of projects centered around Black British art history from 1994 onwards. Just to give a bit more context about the Stuart Hall Library, since the organization started in '94, it's been in existence. So it's been there for 30 years, and firstly, it was very much an institutional library. It was being used by curators who were working for Iniva, some researchers, but very much a closed space. But in 2007, it officially launched as the Stuart Hall Library. So for some of you might be familiar with the cultural theorist Stuart Hall. He's very well known in the UK for his work around media, representation, and just thinking, and one of the leading sort of thinkers around cultural theory, and really defined that term, cultural theory, and was the first chair of Iniva. And so really it was an homage to him, but also thinking about actually his relationship to artistic practice in the UK, because what a lot of people don't know is that he was heavily involved with the Black arts movement in the UK, and was very much in dialogue with artists who were in turn inspiring him. And that it does tend to be undervalued when people look at his work, so I just wanted to highlight that. The archive has also been something that's always been very present in Iniva's work and history, even though it hasn't been accessible, and still kind of working to make it more accessible. Because also just to give context to me, before I started, there had previously been one project archivist who created a survey of the archive, but no dedicated collection work had been done. So there's been this 30-year history that has been collected, been stewarded by librarians who've done a really amazing job at starting to put that history together, and also other staff members who are really dedicated to making sure their projects were being documented. But it does need collection work, it does need care and attention, and actually much like a library, which also needs care and attention, items in the archive can be confusing and ambiguous and really difficult to define and hold. And so we've really started to focus on doing some of that work, and for the next couple of years, that's a real focus of ours. And mine too. So really excited to think about that, and started to do some really exciting works to bring researchers, but also young people, artists, and especially those with a research-based practice into the space, not just accessing the library, but also the archive. So yeah, that's the library, which is currently in Pimlico, London. Just that little door behind you is our archive storeroom, which isn't the biggest space, but it is really nice to have a dedicated space to store our archive material. So if you're ever in London, please come visit. It's a completely free, accessible space. Literally anyone can join and come. They don't have to be an academic. They don't have to be a dedicated researcher. And it is a reference library, but it's this a real concentration on being able to access material on art and contemporary art and visual art practice. And yeah, just to give, again, context about what is in the library collection, we have we've divided it into quite a few sections, and the archive is definitely a reflection of those sections in the library. So we have our exhibition catalogues, which are arranged in by geographical location where the exhibitions have taken place, and so it tends to be a good starting point for people first coming into the space for the first time, especially if they have a geographical focus. We also have our artist monograph section, so works that focus specifically on the work of a particular artist. A zine library, which is really lovely, focusing on activism and art practice and the intersections of those. And then finally, our journal section, which is very, very broad and wide and does have traditional art journals like Art Forum that you'll find in lots of other art libraries, but also very specific and special ones like Chimarenga, which is a South African journal of art practice, Small Axe, which is a journal of Caribbean criticism. And so it doesn't just focus on art, but also the references that people are making, and also our essays and theory section, which is particularly my favorite section because I think there's always a surprise about what you're going to find. And that's actually one of my favorite things about libraries and archives is that spontaneity and being able to discover something that you weren't looking for. And it tends to be quite a fun space. Just to be able to do that. I wish I could sit and read all day, to be honest. And the archive definitely is in conversation with the library in that respect because a lot of the library collection has developed through projects, through development, through conversations we've been having with the people who are coming into the space, recommending us stuff. We do have a small budget to purchase, but also receive quite a lot of donations as well. And when we do have a new project, we tend to try and make sure there's additional material to support that work and also tie that into new material and records that are being collected as part of the archive. And the Artist Files archive is a really great example of that. But first, I do want to bring you to this Stuart Hall quote. So, constituting an archive, which was in third text, this quote, "The moment of an archive represents the end of a kind of creative innocence, a beginning of a new stage of self-consciousness, a self-reflexivity, hard word, sorry, in an artistic movement." And in this particular quote, he was referring to another archive, so the AVA archive, the African and Asian Visual Arts Archive, which at the time was a very important resource, again, very similar to the Iniva's Artist Files archive in the sense that it's this archive of ephemeral material capturing artistic practice, and began in this very DIY way of just wanting representation, trying to think about how people could come and find information about artists, especially who weren't being represented in maybe mainstream institutions, and there weren't publications available about them. But it's kind of floating now in the way that often happens to collections where when there is a loss of funding, when there is a loss of stewardship, it does tend to get split up and the custodians do have separate pieces. And so on a separate point, it's nice to be on a bit of an investigation about similar archives and still trying to figure out the different pieces of AVA, which is kind of a grandfather archive to some of the, I guess, Iniva's Artist Files archive. And this quote is something we refer to a lot because, yes, Iniva's archive is an institutional archive, but also this capturing of conversations, meetings, people, projects, ideas, especially of this moment of the 90s into the early 2000s when a lot of artists in the UK of colour, so the UK Black Arts movement was really starting to kind of have this self-reflective period of a lot of artists in the 70s and 80s being able to exhibit, being able to create their own DIY spaces. And so this archive and the idea of trying to capture this information is this self-reflexivity of that moment, of this consciousness, trying to understand it and in a different sort of way. And maybe, yes, also a loss of innocence in the sense that there does have to be this thought and I guess sometimes administrative care behind that as well. So some of the objectives I'm just thinking about in this presentation is thinking about representation of artists in the archive, looking both at artistic practice and identity, exploring issues of bias that are present in the archive and methodologies used to counteract this bias. So the artist file collection, it's been accrued through various donations by individuals and collection through staff. So there's two main mechanisms that works have begun to enter the archive. Sometimes that have been, I guess, yes, the actively collecting material by staff members in a very informal ways, and sometimes that's been through visiting exhibitions. Sometimes it's just having a conversation, being like, oh, there's not a lot of information we have about this artist. There's this leaflet we can grab. So actually, yeah, just to, again, give context, the material is very much exhibition leaflets, invitations. We have a lot of 35mm slides, more than I sometimes know what to do with. Yeah, and again, concentrating around the early 90s to mid-2000s, and reflects the mission of the organization and the people that we have been interacting with. So a previous librarian, recently just through investigation, because as I said, there hasn't been a lot of, I guess, collection work, so just trying to think about the start of this archive and the provenance, just speaking to former librarians who began to do this work. So Anja Zeigler, who now is, I think, the library manager at the University of Dresden in Germany, was one of the librarians working on this collection, and she was able to inform me that this artist file collection was really created as a response to absence of published material, especially material that wasn't available about particular artists. So yes, we had the artist monograph section in the library, but how about if an artist hadn't had the chance to publish their work? If there isn't budget to do that, how else can there be information about them be stored, and how can people access and find more about them? So really it's this was created as a really natural response to just trying to have alternative forms of information aside from the traditionally published book. And so it's really lovely to see that it's grown. The cataloguing of the archive collection was so part of the Transforming Collections, Reimagining Art, Nation and Heritage. And so this was headed up by UAL's Decolonizing the Arts Institute, and also in partnership with the UAL's Creative Computing Institute. So there is a little bit about AI in that, even though that's not my focus, but I thought you guys might be interested to know. So that combines art historical, museological research and interactive machine learning to surface patterns of bias within collection information. So yeah, that picture is just doing a workshop with some of the researchers. You can see the back of my head. But yeah, and some of those 35mm slides, some of those really dodgy photocopies that have been made, but also now have become really special objects. And I do think it's amazing how, yeah, dodgy photocopies can become something that's really precious. And actually that's been an important part of this work as well, which I will touch on a bit later, but actually that ability to interact with interdisciplinary practitioners, thinking about collections in several different ways, and I think is a key part of thinking about care and how to archive and how to start looking at dimensions of objects, especially when you're, like, as an archivist, I come in from this perspective of an archivist, but actually how can my colleagues who are doing work in museums bring different perspectives? How can my colleagues who are doing work in machine learning, but with collections, bring different perspectives? So bias in archival practice. So something that came up as a result of some of these discussions that, again, I was starting to think about as I began cataloguing this project is a lot of artists, especially who are minorities in the Western world, their work is often defined by their ethnic and cultural background. In many cases, there may be reasonings, and that's because actually that's been a conscious and purpose choice, and often, yeah, their work does reflect that. But then assumptions can be made in interpretation without consideration about how an artist has chosen to define their own work. Yeah, and despite best efforts, there will always be inherent bias in archival collections and the work that goes behind that. But how can we start to investigate that and counteract it? Another example of bias in Iniva's artist file collection is that some artists have huge files that are maybe sometimes even go across 2 different folders, whereas someone might literally have one singular item, which is a postcard. And why has that happened, really? Has it been because that person wasn't as active? And yes, that might be the case, but also someone had a particular interest in an artist and went out of their way to collect lots and lots of material. I think we have a Labena Hamid puzzle in the collection, which is like something really weird and wonderful, but and sometimes several press cuttings. And so you can see there's a lot of labor that's gone into developing one artist file, but with another, actually there hasn't been as much. And that can be very obvious in some cases, actually, when we know this has been, when you look and you think, actually, that why isn't there an artist file on this particular artist when it feels very natural that this should be here, but it's not, and there's an absence. I think I will even go as far to say as there's a lot of representation of women artists, but I think there could definitely be more women who are represented who aren't, and so why has that happened? So that's an example of bias, even though this is a collection that has been literally created to combat bias. And so I'm sure in 30 years, someone's going to be like, why did I make that decision? And that's very, very fair. But it's just something that I'm trying to be actively conscious of as I conduct my work. This is just a very random example, but there's an artist who's represented in our collection, Uzo Ogonu. His work is often described as merging European modernist traditions and Igbo imagery, which is very, very true. So this is a really good example of this image where I think it's Tower Bridge in London, and actually some of the shapes and imagery he's using goes back to Igbo imagery from Nigeria and this kind of merging of culture, but actually, which came up in discussions with a lot of, I guess, my colleagues working in museum collections and working in gallery spaces, is that often in interpretation of artwork, there's not a lot of focus, especially on those particular artists, thinking about the materials or the technical aspects of their work, and are actually just focusing on very specific aspects of their identity, which, yes, are important, but aren't looking at the technical aspects, where they might look at that in an artist who is born in the UK or has roots that can easily be identified in the UK. And yeah, so some of my colleagues who I'll just give my props to, so Anjali Dalal-Clayton and Ananda Rutherford, who have been looking at this in particular, and it's been really lovely to be in conversation with them, as actually this project that started very much at the same time as I started their research work, and being able to reflect on that as I begin archiving. So yeah, how do we combat bias? Yeah, I think that's an okay text size. So yeah, a critical and care-led approach to cataloging. So thinking about problematic language and terms that are often repeated when thinking about practice, especially archival practice and collections practice. So a precursor to the Transforming Collections project was another project called Provisional Semantics, which was particularly looking at, I guess, offensive and often racist language in museum collections or gallery collections. And so that was a project that kind of directly led into the Transforming Collections project, but is very, very different. And so actually thinking about that as a basis for that project, I was really starting to think about actually what language is harmful when speaking about artistic practice, or can be very typical and not thinking outside the box when it comes to describing the work of artists of African, Caribbean, and Asian diasporic perspectives, and actually trying to very conscious of that as we're cataloging. And those terms aren't necessarily offensive, but maybe sometimes stereotypical or just very easy to go into certain boxes. As I mentioned, those interdisciplinary conversations. So when working with colleagues, conducting research in museum collections and machine learning, it enabled a more holistic approach to think about archiving and actually think about data. So that's what I would say from my machine learning colleagues, is that actually there are biases, as we all know, in machine learning models, in data sets that come up again and again. So actually, what are the ways that we can start to think about mitigating those? Some of the models that we were working with that they were testing out was thinking about different tools, maybe thinking about information that is missing in collections. So how can they start to identify those? Something that came up again and again is that machine learning is stupid. It's not something that has all of the answers. And so actually seeing the mistakes that were coming up, were also identifying this, we're maybe not finding the information we're looking for firstly having to teach it, but also if there's so much information that's missing, how do you even start to create a machining model that can start to identify that? And it does take a lot of training and learning. So as we're doing that work, what do we start to think about? Which again is easier said than done, because when you're archiving a large collection and you're one person, it's really difficult to do everything which in the way you know is the best way to do it versus the time constraints of a project. So to be honest, I don't have the answer to that. I'm still trying to figure that out. If anyone has suggestions, please let me know. And approaching the archiving process with sensitivity to the artist's self-identification around and the complexities of their practice. So actually, thinking about how an artist has self-described, thinking about primary sources when an artist is talking about themselves and their practice, rather than secondary and tertiary sources, which again isn't always easy, thinking about quotes that an artist has used to describe their practice, starting to embed that in several different ways. I think that's a process we've trying to, at least with myself and volunteers who I work with, actually, when we start to describe an artist, how do we privilege that information? And that's really thinking about the words they use themselves. One way I've been attempting to address that bias is the implementation of authority records. So just to define it, an authority record is a record. So this is the official definition that I found on the internet somewhere. But an authoritative form, the form of a person's name, corporate name, family name, place, uniform, preferred title, series title, subject, etc., often in a library or file of bibliographic records, which you could say an artist's file collection is a series of bibliographic records, so something specific to a company or a person as an individual record. I try not to stick so closely to these records as being an authoritative name, but more so as an additional tool to think about a person's practice and information about them. So I'll show you an example of one of those in just a second. Rather than thinking of it as this authoritative form, it is more so an additional aid to start giving people a way into that artist, provide more holistic information about that artist, rather than actually sometimes if we're doing, item level cataloging where we're looking at one singular item at a time, especially when it's a really large collection, how can we add that further context to that record or that person? And just to explain how that works, so for example, if, I don't know, this espresso cup was an item in the archive and this belonged to Paul who just spoke, it might just be described as an espresso cup that was drank at the Iniva event on the 1st of September, but then there's an additional sort of field where it will have Paul's name. You can click on it and you can find out more about Paul, his practice, and maybe even the work that he was doing on that day. And so, it's just a very simple way of thinking about adding additional context, especially when there might not be additional resources or time to do other work that could be helpful. And another way that it just adds to the overall improving the archive online catalogue is it just improves the overall discoverability of a material. So you're searching an artist's name online, and then you can see all of on the database, on the catalogue, and you're able to see all of the items associated with that name, as long as that, virtual metadata file that has that information is being used and attached to that item. So this is an example of one of the authority records. So the artist is in Obsidera. So this is, specifically what is called a name authority record. You can have it for a person, so individual person, but also a family, also a company. So yeah, various authorized name ways the name can be spelt, sometimes nicknames, parallel forms, so also if it's spelt in different ways, it's more discoverable. What we've also tended to do if their name has another form in another language, trying to input that language as well. So for example, with like kanji characters, if some people wanted to type there, it would still come up as that person's name, even if it appears in the search results as English. Yeah, context, there are downsides with this in terms of actually this is something that might periodically need to be looked at and updated, especially if several time has passed and just needing to update that information. So something we've done is just think about general context of the work, the way Sadera has described her own work, and general history, and thinking about actually how Sadera has been described as a practitioner, modes of working, and several other things before we even start to get onto her ethnic cultural background and how it might be important to her work, which it could and often is. So actually what usually comes first in authority record is the dates of existence and then history. But what I've opted to do is to swap general context as a primer and trying to think about how to privilege that information that thinks about practice rather than diving straight into history. And yeah, I think it's still kind of in the early beginning stages, because also to give context, before launching this catalogue has only been live for about a year now. So since about last November, and before that we had a very complicated Excel spreadsheet, which still is in use somewhat, to be honest, but trying to move away from it and slowly trying to move information about collections onto this online catalogue. Yeah, next steps and reflections. Yeah, so cataloguing of the artist file collection continues with support from the Hausenwerth Institute. So actually the Hausenwerth Institute is a charitable arm of the galleries, Hausenwerth, but specifically focuses on artist archives and the cataloguing of artist archives. So actually I think we're the first organization and project outside of the US to get funding from this particular fund. And so this phase will really be used to enhance the first set of records that were catalogued, and actually think about the digital material that has been produced as a result of the Transforming Collections project. As you all know, digital material and posting that online is very complicated, and there's a lot of copyright and intellectual property to consider. So we're slowly thinking about how to do that in ways that won't get us in trouble, which is, again, there's a lot of material there. So with the Transforming Collections project, we just selected a small sample, but not even small, but like a sample of about 200, 180 artists, and just focusing around trying to get a range of different artists represented, whether it be an artist who has a particularly large file or small file. And a really important theme that kind of stepped out from actually thinking about that discrepancy is the word absence came up, like loads and loads of times, became a really important sticking point for the work we're doing. But how do we think about absence in the archive, but also what is that information telling us? I think what's really amazing is that we are a contemporary archive, so there are people we can just have conversations with, which is lovely, and you're not always fortunate to do with archives. Next steps do involve just reaching out directly to artists represented in that initial sample. Still, quite a large amount of artists, but slowly doing it in phases and trying to have those conversations where possible. The collection itself is very large. This is kind of a guess from with the additional set of records we're looking at with the funding we received from the Hausenwerth Institute. it's approximately 2,000 individual files, which is a hell of a lot. So yeah, it's trying to slowly think about just even starting to catalog and organize that work and repackage it is a task, but proceeding. So yeah, a lot of the work is thinking about actually how to do this incredibly large amount of work, but still do it with care and consideration to represent artistic practice rather than being like, oop, this is a post-it in this, or a postcard in this artist file. And use really sneaky ways to try and do that. Again, integration with Stuart Hall library resources and the archive, Iniva's online archive catalogue. So these are two separate resources. So this was done just because Stuart Hall Library's online library catalogue is an open source system called Koha, which is specifically for libraries. But it's not best for, I guess, use of cataloguing archive-specific material and has been in place for quite a while. Yeah, the current catalogue we're using for the archive is called Apexio, which is a really lovely, relatively new software, but very intuitive. But there's a lot of resources that link to archive material. So actually, how can we start to put those together? I'm very fortunate to have some amazing volunteers, so we're slowly, who are really interested in archives and might be moving into that sector. So thinking with them how they think about resources and access and materials, and how they would want it to be integrated. I'm particularly interested in UX, just from thinking about libraries and archives and how people access information and move through systems, and very much hold my hands up, and it's definitely not the best on our website. So yeah, just thinking about how to make it more pleasant and accessible, and that integration with several different sites and resources and the navigation between those, and just trying to make it a very much smooth process, or smoother than it currently is. And again, making that digital material accessible within reason when it can be, at least at the moment, just working on giving better access on site through the computers that are currently in the space, and then thinking about how certain materials might be available off site as well. Yeah, and then just reflecting on resources that can be generated from the artist files and the artist archive. I think a key difference between the artist file collection and the artist archive is that it's, I guess, one step away from the person who might have been in their own personal artist archive. It has maybe their own artwork, it has personal material that's very much in context of themselves, and a lot of artist archives do tend to be a bit messy, but I do think there's this really interesting relationship that can be connected there, and how we think about that. And so we're thinking of several ways at the moment how we might start that conversation. Currently don't have a huge amount of programming planned, just because there's a lot going on in other areas of Iniva's work, but thinking about maybe even just through conversations we're having with artists who do have their own archive, and how we can have those reflections in our own artist file archive. So thinking about legacy, which is essentially something that connects both of these two concepts, the legacy of the artists and how they define their own practice, and legacy within an institution, because it still is an institution despite, I guess, maybe more slightly radical work that it does sometimes. Thinking about legacy, thinking about sometimes thinking about grief and and how archives can also often be related to that. Thinking about joy and how that can be related to both the personal artist file archive and the artist file collection, and a lot of different themes that we're thinking about. We have had the opportunity to do really lovely events. So this poster is just a really lovely flyer. It's from an event we did. So we're doing a partnership with another organisation called Mayday Rooms, which is another archive in the UK, which mostly collects around activism, left-leaning material in terms of protest material, and actually thinking about some of the conjunctions between our two archives, even though they're very, very different. And ours does have material that links to theirs, but in very much visual arts practice sort of way, and it's not as obvious. And so actually how can we work together to complement our two archives and maybe where there are gaps because they're very text-based as well. But one of the events we did was working with another practitioner, Eva Husseini, who had started her own sort of West Asian and North African women's art library, which started off as a university project. So Eva was one of our volunteers, but began to work with us in several different ways, and was really interested in actually some of the West Asian and North African women represented in the Artist File archive. And so in particular picked material from the library that she had started, material from Iniva's Artist File collection, and material from Mayday Room's archive that could link to some of the themes that people were exploring in their work, especially thinking about protest, thinking about different sites of activism in West Asian and North African countries, and maybe how those have been represented in the UK, and also films films that could also be shown alongside archive material. So we did a bit of a screening. It was really well attended. I think we had 55 people come, which is really lovely, and just some really great films. So yeah, again, I picked the example before of Zainab Sedera because that's someone's artist file who directly linked to a programming event. And yeah, really excited to try and engage the archive in fun and contemporary ways, and also bringing in slightly different audiences. So this particular event was trying to specifically think about young people between the ages of 16 to 25, introducing the idea of what an archive is and how to connect that with artistic practice. We also recently had, I guess, one of our first archival exhibitions in our current space. So thinking about, which was called Shifting the Center, and that was thinking about artistic practice, but also through the lens of activism that has happened and has been represented in artistic practice. And so these are several ways that we started to engage with, not just the Artist File archive, but also Iniva's own archive. Yeah, so just to recap, there are widespread issues of how artistic practice and identity can be described in not only archive collection, but museum and gallery collections. A critical approach to cataloguing is essential for combating inherent bias of archives and collections in general. And spaces of interdisciplinary and collaborative learning are essential for understanding the issues that are pervasive across disciplines. And yeah, I want to thank you for listening, and I do also just want to reiterate that kind of ask to think about cataloguing artistic practice, thinking about representing artistic practice in collections. And those of you who are maybe working or investigating in those areas, I'd love for you to share if you do have anything to share. Yeah.